This is a production of PBS Charlotte.
This weekend Off the Record, it's NBA All-Star Weekend in Charlotte. Good for the fans, good for the economy, not so good for getting to and from the office uptown. Charlotte's 2016 Uptown protests playing out again this week in a Mecklenburg courtroom, including the video confession of a protester accused of murder. The nationwide immigration debate comes to Charlotte City Hall. Are police traffic stops targeting immigrants? And should undocumented immigrants serve on city committees? Plus, council members also decide maybe we shouldn't ask the voters about four-year terms the same time we're, up for re-election. Off the Record's next on PBS Charlotte. Hi, I'm Jeff Sonnier. This is Off the Record, where we talk about the stories you've been talking about this week. And if you watch the news, read the news, or listen to the news, you'll recognize the names and faces around our table. Dedrick Russell from WBTV and Mark Becker from WSOC-TV. Thanks for joining us. Also, Eli Portillo of the Charlotte Observer and Ashley Fahey of the Charlotte Business Journal. Thank you for joining us. Thank you also for joining us at home. You can join our conversation. Just email your questions, comments, and Valentine chocolates and flowers to offtherecord@WTVI.org. Well, All-Star Weekend, if you love basketball, this is a great place to be in Charlotte right now. If you love commuting, not so great right now. Talk about what we're going to see this weekend, starting tonight and through Sunday night, in terms of events and financial impact, but mostly, I guess, inconvenience when it comes to folks who don't care about the first two.
I think that's the right word, right? Inconvenience, and at what point does inconvenience become more than the gain? In talking to people uptown, downtown, can I say uptown, downtown? I think the overriding sense I got from people is we're excited, but we're really not sure how much of a hassle this is going to be. And
right.
Today I think a lot of companies told people stay home. Don't go to work.
Yeah.
Don't worry about it. You work from home and that kind of thing. So my own sense was that the commute today was a little quicker because there's less traffic. But I think in the end, I think we're still excited and at the same time a little anxious, right?
I don't know if our city's different than others, because it seems like there's always kind of a separation or a gap between what uptown, the tourism industry, how they regard these events and how they affect or don't affect people who just live in town. I mean, you can say the same thing about the CIAA. To a lesser extent, you could say it about the DNC, that if you were uptown, it affected, restaurants trying to get a table or trying to get to the office. But outside of where the actual event is taking place, life kind of goes on. So, I guess a lot of folks outside where the event's taking place ask what's the fuss all about. Talk about can we talk about the impact and how it does maybe affect the folks who aren't directly affected, who don't feel the event?
Well, one of the things I was a little surprised about was I guess it's been about a week ago now, South Park sent out something to their businesses saying, we're gearing up for something that could be really disruptive here. We're going to have traffic in just a one-way pattern around. They told people, tell your employees not to plan on driving and parking at work, because we need to close off one of the parking decks just for pickup and drop off. And they expected enough people that they said to the stores, don't come to us, that is the mall management, for help with shoplifters, because we're going to be busy. Police are going to be there. So, and if other all-star events, I think it was in Houston, they had one and the mall packed so full, police had to be called in to evacuate the mall, and it spilled into neighborhoods. Talking to one guy, he said it took an hour to go 5 miles, because
Wow.
he stop and start. He stopped and dropped his car off. Now Houston's different, near the interstate, near the mall, and walked to the mall the rest of the way. So hopefully that isn't the case here, but there will be events at the two malls, and police were saying gear up there. So it's not just uptown.
Yeah, exactly. Right? And it's a marketing event, because Charlotte is once again on the center stage, and everybody's going to be looking at Charlotte. And then when people come to Charlotte, what will they take away from Charlotte? Will they say that Charlotte is a safe city? I had a good time there. I didn't encounter any crime, anything like that. But then on the second hand, you would have that people are coming to Charlotte who probably never been
Right.
to Charlotte before. And when we first covered the CIAA, there were people who experienced Charlotte for the first time, and they say, wow, this is a great place to live. So why not move my family here to Charlotte? So that is, I think city leaders are looking all of that when people come to Charlotte, they may say that, hey, never been to Charlotte before. It's a nice place to live. Why don't we move our family here to Charlotte?
And of course, city leaders are looking ahead at the RNC next
Right.
year, even though there's a ton of focus and effort obviously spent on making sure all of this weekend's events go off without a hitch. In a lot of ways, I think it's a dry run, and lessons learned will be applied to the RNC when it comes to Charlotte. That's on the horizon, and I think that's the next comparable event.
Yeah, a lot of even private owners, building owners in Uptown see this as a logistics and planning exercise for the RNC because that's coming up in less than 2 years. So there's a lot of prep work that they can apply, lessons learned, as Eli said, to the RNC.
Yeah, the DNC was here, 2012. The city, the
like
Uptown,
forever,
has
but-
changed remarkably
Very
since then. So I'm
dramatically.
not really sure that's a fair kind of a run through for the RNC. This is probably, as you mentioned, a better, more recent, more current kind of a exercise. for them.
Listen, and this is, I think, what Charlotte wants to be, right? Atlanta just had the Super Bowl. Lord knows this is not the Super Bowl as much as we want to pump it up to be. But we want to be a city big enough to have that mass to attract events like this. And that's just sort of the cost of doing business, I think. And we'll see how it goes. I mean, I think, again, on balance, people are mostly excited. All it takes is a couple of bad events, and that could all change.
Changes
But for now, I think people are.
And when you look at the NBA All-Star, it brings up another issue, the economic mobility here in Charlotte, that even though we have a lot of people who live in Charlotte, but there are a lot of people who simply cannot afford to even take part in the NBA All-Star with game tickets, 1,000, 2,000. So,
I'm one
didn't you
of them.
get your ticket?
No,
So,
ticket, no.
so while the city is talking about economic mobility, I guess they have to start bringing in events where everybody can participate and not just between the haves and the have-nots.
Well, this is kind of the great equalizer, the NBA All-Star Game. If you look about ticket availability, it literally says tickets not available to the public, whether you're, I guess, a rich guy or not so rich. There is always the secondary market, but theoretically, the only people who get to go to the All-Star Game, to the dunk contest, are the people who are invited by the NBA and their sponsors. And so,
And I'm also interested to see how, after this weekend, how broadly people from the community are able to participate. A lot of the events and parties are private, invitation only, or have very high ticket prices. So with 150,000 people coming in from out of town, I think it's going to be interesting once the show leaves to talk to people in Charlotte and sort of see what the impact was and how many people got to go out and experience a piece of it themselves locally from the community.
But security is going to be tight. I guess clear bags, they're emphasizing clear bags on the light rail. So once you get to a point of light rail, you have to get off, be searched, and then go back on. So, I guess no chatter of anything bad happening, but I guess they just want to be safe than sorry.
last quick question. Financial impact, do we know what it will be, or do we have an expectation on that?
So the number that keeps being thrown around is up to $100 million, and that's based on two comparable All-Star games that have been held in recent years, one of them being New Orleans. Of course, that amount can vary dramatically based on different analyses and what metrics different groups use, but I would expect at least upward of $50 million. I mean, the New Orleans games, by some accounts, brought in at least $45 million, but we'll have a better sense of that, I think, once the event is over. But certainly it will be sizable.
Yeah, if you get a full hotel or standing room outside your restaurant this weekend, or you're a taxi or Uber driver, you got to be thrilled with having business all weekend long.
The NBA has blocked rooms off in 28 hotels, so that tells you right there. Yeah.
Well, good for them, and I guess we'll be watching on Sunday night, or maybe watching Daytona. I don't know.
What?
Just saying, same weekend.
And let me just jump in there. I mean, just the juxtaposition of the two. Mm-hmm. When I got here many years ago, I mean, Daytona, that was a huge event, right? And NASCAR, headquartered here, this sort of shows how the two have changed.
Yeah.
in our market.
One more quick thing, too. A photographer I work with, Doug, mentioned that the last time the NBA All-Star Game was here, some of the NBA folks said they were thrilled because it means we won't be back to Charlotte for 25 years. So hopefully they're not saying that this year about the NBA All-Star Game. But welcome, NBA. Let's talk a little bit about the trial that's going on in the Mecklenburg County Courthouse this weekend. It's a murder trial, and that's always significant. But because it was a murder that took place during the protest of 2016, we're kind of reliving the whole, or we will be reliving the whole, situation all over again in the testimony. Mark, were you in the courtroom this week?
I was in the courtroom, and I'm telling you, it is 180 degrees different from the environment, the atmosphere that took the streets here back in September of 2016. I mean, it was electric is one word. I guess it was just really a charged, a lot of anger, a lot of frustration that boiled over. The courtroom was, the defendant's name is Raekwon Borum. We're calling it the boring trial, the Borum trial. But I mean, it's very sedate. In fact, the issue that just came up was he was apparently falling asleep in court and couldn't pay attention. And so they're questioning the antidepressants he's taking. They brought in the people from the jail who administer the drugs to say, have you been giving them, how much, and so forth. But it is the way justice really should work, and that is the word they use, I think, is dispassionately, right? You take the emotion out of it, and you have calm, reasonable people sitting and listening to evidence and so forth. So as much as it will bring us back to 2016, I think the bigger question and the interesting thing is it will show us where we are now, right? Is that anger still here? Is that frustration still here? Have we gotten better? And I asked somebody that the other day, and they kind of thought for me. I said, well, I think so, but we're still not there.
Well, Borum's the guy, let's remind people, he's the protester who apparently brought a gun, or allegedly brought a gun to the protests. Fired that gun, he says, to disperse the crowd, but in the end, another protester wound up dead from a bullet wound. He's now charged with first-degree murder. I know that the defense is claiming, have you seen the video, by the way, the video when the moment that it happened? I was watching that online, and it's just frightening to see how quickly, as charged as that situation was, the protest itself, to see that crowd just suddenly turn and run. I mean,
I was in that crowd.
I was going to ask you about, did anyone experience that firsthand?
I was in that crowd. I was in front of the Omni Hotel on Trade Street, and I don't know exactly how close I was to Justin Carr, the protester who was shot, but things were already very tense with the police. There was a line of police officers in riot gear. There were some bangs, and there was some smoke or tear gas, and then all of a sudden everybody ran. And we in the crowd, my colleague and I, didn't know what had even happened. There were police officers shouting, "Run!" One officer shouted something along the lines of, "If you stay here, your life is in danger, go." And we didn't learn for probably almost an hour and a half or 2 hours that someone had been shot and killed. So I was struck, going back to your point, walking around yesterday in front of the Omni Hotel, just by, even though this was a little more than 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago or so, it feels like we're in a very different time, with the excitement around the All-Star Game. Walking around in front of that exact same spot, I just paused, and you would never know that a man had lost his life there, and that those same streets had been flooded with tear gas and riot police. It feels like it feels a lot longer ago than it was.
Yeah, and again, it's ironic that it comes while the streets will be full again for a very different celebratory reason. I mean, and cities have, evolved, and in time we move on from good and from bad.
And it's just like the news cycles. That was the thing 2.5 years ago. Now our battle is revaluation, affordable housing, education. So therefore, as a news cycle, just live until another big story takes over, and then we could go on.
One other question I have about this particular trial, there was so much talk on social media and among some out there that night that this shooting, this Justin Carr who died from a gunshot wound, that the police were responsible. Obviously, there's a confession that will be introduced in trial on video. There is actual surveillance video, but there is still an element of the community that believes the police and not Mr. Borum is responsible for this. I mean, that's the one thing about this particular trial that I wondered about, kind of peeling off the scab of something that's kind of healed up since then, that whole distrust of the police, and can we really trust what they tell us, and what really happened out there?
I will say, in talking to people involved in the case from the prosecution side, they want this case. They want people to see that confession. They want people to see this thing play out. They want to basically say, look, we've been waiting 2.5 years here. This is why that whole theory of the police shooting never held water. And there have been some very ardent people in Charlotte Uprising who've made this their cause célèbre. They're sticking to it, and we have seen some of those people in the courtroom. Their numbers have dwindled from where they were. And the first few times Mr. Borum went to court, it was a little interesting when there were outcries in the courtroom. That has stopped. But there are people who still firmly hold to that theory. I think there's a lot fewer of them.
And, it's going to be very interesting how this plays out, because at first he was offered a plea agreement of 16 years in second-degree murder. He didn't take that plea, so now he's charged with first-degree murder. And first-degree murder meaning that, that there was premeditation there. So, it'd just be very interesting if the jury, once they're seated, to come back to say that is that the right charge, since he just said that he shot the gun just to disperse the crowd. I didn't intend to shoot or kill.
Well, and again, the defense, if you're trying to keep this person out of prison or off death row, then one of the things you prey upon, you play upon, is that distrust in the community. I mean, there depends on the jury, who's seated and what they believe going in, I suppose. And how convincing you can make this argument that others in the community still believe that it wasn't Mr. Borum, it was somebody
They just
else.
have to show that reasonable doubt. That's all they have to do, is reasonable doubt.
And to be clear, quite often juries sort of settle somewhere in the middle, right? And you get into the minutiae here, into the weeds, but they don't. I don't think we'll have to come back with first-degree murder or not guilty. I mean, there's be something what they call lesser included offenses, like a second-degree murder, or even perhaps a voluntary manslaughter, or involuntary. So you have those gradations, and it gets very specific as to which is allowed for the jury to consider. But
and it would be a less jail sentence, because right now he's facing, life in prison, but something else he could be out, in 10, 15 years.
Well, the trial's going to go on for weeks. Hopefully when we are talking about this over the next couple of weeks, it'll be just about the trial itself, and we'll see how the public reacts afterwards. We saw how the City Council reacted this week to what has become the nationwide immigration debate, becoming very local. There was nothing on the agenda that specifically mentioned immigration, and yet that seemed to be the topic of conversation in several items at the council meeting this week. You both were there, right?
I was there, and they used to say all politics is local. I think we're living in an era now where all politics is national.
Right.
There were 2 agenda items that were pretty routine. One was to accept a grant for CMPD to conduct DWI checkpoints, and one was to allow people who aren't registered voters but do live in the city of Charlotte to serve on city-appointed boards and commissions, like the Tree Advisory Council.
That's ho-hum stuff, right?
Very ho-hum, very meat and potatoes, city council, local government. But both of them turned into, very bitter hour-long debates. In the CMPD case, some members, led by at-large member Braxton Winston, said that with ICE conducting stepped-up immigration raids, CMPD should reconsider putting checkpoints in areas like Central Avenue that have high immigrant populations, because they're fostering distrust in the community. And in the case of the city board, someone pointed out that by allowing people who aren't registered voters, in theory, you could be allowing people who are not legal residents, who are undocumented immigrants, to serve on city boards. Both the Republican members, Tariq Bokhari and Ed Driggs, were against both of these. It broke down on party lines when it came to the vote. But it was a very interesting debate, because as several people on council pointed out, this is really more of a federal issue. We're trying to talk about the city of Charlotte here. these issues are being played out on our stage when that's maybe not an appropriate place for them. This is the national immigration debate, but Charlotte's in the crosshairs.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the checkpoints first. Because of our sheriff and other sheriffs' decisions around the state to get rid of this 287G program, which used to have the sheriff's department working together with ICE to identify undocumented immigrants and hold them when they were charged with other crimes. Now ICE says we're going to have to do more out in the street kind of enforcement instead of doing our enforcement within the confines of the jail. There's a lot of folks in the community who say don't cooperate with ICE, but if you're not cooperating with ICE and you happen to have a checkpoint where they're at, I mean, it seems like there has to be some cooperation between these different law enforcement in order to prevent these kinds of miscommunications and misunderstandings. I mean, I think the police department's made it clear we're not doing ICE's job for them, but if they're out there doing DUI in the same neighborhood that ICE is doing whatever they're doing, then is that guilt by association, or is that truly a problem for this city? I mean, that's the question that I guess was discussed at council this weekend. I mean, do we have a resolution on this?
Well, what CMPD officials said is that they make their checkpoint decisions in advance based on data about where there are fatal wrecks, where they're speeding.
It's a traffic checkpoint. That's what they were out there for.
Right.
Traffic enforcement.
They were saying it was basically a coincidence that Central Avenue had a checkpoint at the same time ICE was conducting raids and stopping people in that area. So I think moving forward, there will probably be a lot more attention on where those checkpoints are.
Right.
But CMPD, didn't say we're not going to do those, or we're going to. They're kind of in a catch-22 because ICE, they can't work with ICE and learn where ICE is doing enforcement, which means they have to hope that they don't cross paths.
It's just, again, that was my point, that the politics are kind of intruding on what ought to be pure law enforcement in this case, I would think.
Well, and Councilmember Bakari had an interesting counterpoint. He basically chided his colleagues and said, we were trying to make a statement, the sheriff was trying to make a statement, the county was trying to make a statement by stopping the 287G program, but that didn't make ICE go away. He said we took it from the jail and put it on the streets, and now it's made the situation worse. So that was his argument, was that there are unintended consequences of the politics at play here.
Now, what about the boards and commissions? I mean, what's going to happen with that? I mean, someone has tossed the immigration issue into what ought to be kind of a cut and dry decision about if you live in Charlotte or you don't live in Charlotte, can you serve on a committee? Where is that headed, given that now we're talking about immigration as well?
Well, I guess it remains to be seen. I know the mayor yesterday announced that she was forming an ad hoc committee headed up by Larkin Eggleston, a council member, to examine sort of the relationship between immigrants in Charlotte and, sort of what their fears are, what some of the things they're concerned about. Of course, it remains to be seen what that means for some of the boards and the committees. But, the move this week, I believe, authorized them to actually participate in these local boards. But I think someone did mention, the participation in these boards and committees is not always great. So I don't know if this move will change that. I don't know if that will change the dynamics of these local boards and commissions. But I guess we'll have to keep an eye on that.
And I know they were saying that they wanted Charlotte to be a welcoming city. So instead of saying that you can't serve, we want to open it up and say that you can serve. But it's going to be interesting that if you do have somebody on the committee who fits that title, then will they be fearful to come to the meetings?
Right.
Because ICE may be right there and said, okay, then you're on this committee and you meet on Tuesdays at 3:30. We'll be right there. So it's just be very interesting who will volunteer to even do that.
Right, and the mayor was saying before 2009, the city just said, check a box if you live here, if you want to serve on an advisory committee, that was it. In 2009, they added the registered voter requirement, but that also eliminated people who might be former felons who have served their time, people who are, legal residents like green card holders, people who just aren't registered to vote for whatever reason, even though they live in the city. So by getting rid of that registration requirement, that also opens it up to a lot more people than immigrants. But the mayor was also saying, prior to 2009, we were not flooded with undocumented immigrants who really wanted to serve on the tree committee or the, the public art commission.
Right.
So it's interesting to see if this will continue to be an issue that's elevated or if it'll kind of fall away pretty quickly.
But hopefully it'll be an issue that will be solved, because it's good that they're talking about this
Right.
in the open, trying to prepare for what may look like 5 years from now. So I think that it's good that our city leaders are coming together and talking about it and figuring out what to do, but we need to have some solutions.
One other immigration issue that's not council related, we heard the school board or the school superintendent talking about kids being traumatized
Right.
by what's happening in the community with ICE now. I relate. He should be concerned about how kids are affected by lots of things, but kind of get the sense sometimes that there's a lot of overreaction to every little thing that's happening, whether it's the boards and commissions discussion or, I'm just raising the
I
question.
think we can say that about everything,
Yeah.
right? I mean, our information overload. If somebody burps in China, we hear it, because it's on Twitter or whatever. So everybody now is, as you say, all politics or
Right.
everything, or, universal, so that, yes, we now hear everything, feel everything. And we need to learn how to manage this. Yes, I'm sure there are, situations where kids are affected.
Falling
by all
asleep in
this.
class and things like that,
Absolutely.
yeah.
But, I mean, it just, it is a concern.
Yeah, and it's at a point now where every local, politician or every superintendent has to take a position on these things, and sometimes a very strong position. Whereas
Right.
before, if it was a national issue that was seen locally but wasn't as prevalent as we're seeing today, maybe they weren't having to be as forthcoming or forthright on their issues.
Because at the end of the day, that child will be tested, and those tests will go for or against the school district. So if you have a population that's growing like it is in CMS, and they take tests, then that will be a reflection. If they're stressed and things like that, and they can't do well on the test, then that's not going to look well on the district when you stack them up against all the other school districts.
Well, we're almost out of time. We were supposed to talk about 4-year terms on city council, but since they've decided not to talk about it anymore, maybe we don't have to talk about it either.
We need a 1 hour show.
Let's take a vote. Let's take a vote. A 4-year show or something like that to get we need longer terms for the show. That's what it is. Anyway, thanks for joining us this week, our panel of regulars. We always appreciate your joining us and talking about these issues at home. If you want to join us again anytime, you can get in touch with us with your comments and questions on Off the Record at WTVI.org, and we'll see you next time right here on PBS Charlotte with Off the Record.
A production of PBS Charlotte.